Good evening, and welcome to a conversation with Bishop Robert Barron and Professor William Lane Craig. I'm Michael Uhlman. I am chairman of the board of the Claremont Center for Religion, Reason, and Public Affairs, and for my day job, I teach at the Claremont Graduate School in the Department of Politics. He just got an A to the Our center is proud to sponsor tonight's event with the cooperation and assistance of Bishop Barron's Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and Dr. Craig's Reasonable Faith. We extend our special thanks to Claremont McKenna College for the use of this beautiful new facility and to its staff who have done so much to make this evening possible. As most of you know, thank you. Bishop Barron and Dr. Craig are perhaps the most influential defenders of the truths of the Christian faith on the scene today. Their books, articles, public appearances, videos, and podcasts reach tens of millions of people. Bishop Barron's audience is primarily composed of Catholics, Dr. Craig's primarily of Protestants. The Claremont Center was founded in 2014 by 3 Catholic and 3 Protestant scholars. It occurred to us that someone might wish to bring together 2 Christian leaders and evangelists to address the many concerns facing the Christian community today, taken as a whole. In fact, we were surprised that no one had already done so. Not only do we have a packed house here, as you can see, we also are live streaming the event through the facilities of Word on Fire. Both Word on Fire and Reasonable Faith will make videos available through their websites, as will the Claremont Center in the upcoming weeks once our new website is completed and online. For that reason, I would ask you not to either videotape or sound tape the event this evening, and please, no pictures. Let me say a few words about our 2 speakers and the 2 gentlemen on the stage with them who will be moderating their conversation. I just, in passing, as I was going over my remarks, I did a rough calculation. Just so as you know, these 4 gentlemen on my left have authored or edited 81 books among them. So Bishop Robert Barron is the founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and the auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He is also the host of Catholicism, the groundbreaking award-winning documentary about the Catholic faith, which aired on PBS. He is a best-selling author and has published numerous books, essays, and articles on theology and the spiritual life. His YouTube videos have been viewed over 25 million times, and he has over 1.5 million followers on Facebook. Ordained in 1986 in the Archdiocese of Chicago, Bishop Barron received a master's degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in 1982 and his doctorate in sacred theology from Catholic University of Paris in 1992. Dr. William Lane Craig is research professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University and professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. He is also the founder of the web-based ministry reasonablefaith.org. Dr. Craig earned his BA from Wheaton College, 2 master's degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England, and not content with 1, he got a 2nd PhD in theology from the University of Munich. He has authored or edited over 40 books, as well as nearly 200 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology. In 2016, Dr. Craig was named by the best schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers. Moderating tonight's conversation are 2 of the founders of the Claremont Center. My colleagues, Dr. Stephen Davis, on the far left, is the Russell K. Pitzer Professor of Philosophy, emeritus at Claremont McKenna College, and a senior scholar at the Claremont Center. An expert in the philosophy of religion and analytic theology, he is the author of over 70 academic articles and some 16 books, including Encountering Evil, Live Options in Theodicy, Christian Philosophical Theology, and Rational Faith, a Philosopher's Defense of Christianity. Professor Edward Feser is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Pasadena City College and Senior Scholar at the Claremont Center. He received his BA in Philosophy and Religious Studies from California State College at Fullerton, his Master's in Religion from the Claremont Graduate School, and his doctorate in philosophy from the University of California at Santa Barbara. He has authored or edited 11 books and has written numerous academic articles. His primary academic research interests are in metaphysics, natural theology, the philosophy of mind, and moral and political philosophy. His most recent book is 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, published by Ignatius Press last year. Our program tonight will last about 2 hours. First hour will be a conversation on 3 topics: the challenge of evangelization, science and faith, and advice to Christians living in an increasingly secular world. Bishop Barron and Dr. Craig will then spend about 30 minutes answering questions from the audience. You may submit a question via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram using hashtag GodConversation, one word. Whether you're here at the event or watching online, we'd love to hear from you. We'll pick out a handful of the best questions to ask our esteemed guests. Bishop Barron and Dr. Craig will then spend about 20 minutes questioning one another, followed by a few minutes of closing remarks. Let me again ask you, please silence your cell phones and no sound recording, video recording, or pictures, if you please. As I indicated earlier, the event is being live streamed and will be available for future consumption online. With that, thank you all for coming and for watching online. We look forward to an exciting evening. Join me now in welcoming Bishop Barron and Dr. Craig this evening. I now turn the program over to my colleague, Professor Davis, who will begin the question.
Thank you. Well, gentlemen, let's begin. As you both know, Christianity has always been a religion that believes strongly in evangelism and in converting people to Christ. And there's a very good reason for that. Jesus himself said in the Great Commandment that we are to go to all the world and baptize people in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. We live in a time where it looks as if there are fewer and fewer Christians. That certainly seems to be true in this country and in many other countries. It looks like a time when evangelism is getting more and more difficult. I remember as a child watching Bishop Fulton Sheen, a very good Catholic evangelist, and we all knew who Billy Graham is. But we live in a different time, a different era, and I'm wondering what advice you've got about evangelism, some thoughts you've got about evangelism, some thoughts about methods of evangelism. Bishop Barron, let's begin with you.
You know, I think we face an enormous set of difficulties today in terms of evangelization. One of which is scientism. Maybe we'll get back to that a bit later, but this reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. And if that's the case, then the proclamation of religious truth strikes people as anomalous at best, nonsense at worst. If all that's true is what's scientifically true, then the proclamation of a different kind of truth strikes people as odd. So I think dealing with that issue is paramount today. There's also the great challenge, I would say, of what I call a culture of self-invention. That it's my right or prerogative to invent myself. So my will determines the truth for me at all levels of life. And evangelization is the declaration of the lordship of Jesus. Jesus is the Lord of my life. Well, if I am the Lord of my life, there can't be two lords around here, you know. So in that way, what's a perennial difficulty in evangelization, turning one's life over to Christ, is especially challenging today when this sort of ideology of self-invention is all the rage. So I think those are two of the things that really especially challenge us today. in terms of evangelization.
Dr. Craig, do you want to speak to that?
I think that there are two aspects to this question that need to be addressed. First would be, how do we best equip Christians to share the gospel in our culture? And then the second would be, how do we make our culture more receptive to the gospel when it is proclaimed? With regard to equipping Christians to share the gospel more effectively, let me just mention a few practical considerations. First, you should make sure that you yourself are a growing, spirit-filled Christian. It's not enough just to be religious or be a churchgoer. Can you say with Paul, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me? You're guided and empowered by the Holy Spirit. You know Christ. Only then, I think, are you really ready to begin to be a witness for him. Secondly, I would encourage you then, each of you, to memorize a gospel presentation. There are many of these available, something like the 4 spiritual laws or knowing God personally, whereby you can take an unbeliever step by step through the fundamental points of the gospel and then bring him to a point of decision where you invite him to make a commitment to Christ of his life. And I can tell you there is no greater thrill in the Christian life than to sit with someone and pray with him and lead him in making a commitment of his entire life to Jesus Christ. Combine that gospel presentation with a personal testimony. I'd encourage you to take time to write out the story of how you came to Christ, how you came to faith in him. Memorize it and be able to give it in about 3 minutes. People love to hear your personal story. And so a gospel presentation combined with your personal testimony will be very powerful in evangelism. Thirdly, I'd encourage you to memorize some arguments for the existence of God. The difficulty with so many in our culture today is they think there's no evidence for God's existence, and the average Christian can't give him any. And so he excuses his unbelief. But if you're prepared, you can say, well, I can think of 4 arguments for God's existence. And at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then boom, you're off and ready. You're ready to go with your arguments for God's existence. And I found in sharing with unbelievers, oftentimes all you have to do is list the arguments. You don't even have to present them. Just say God's the best explanation why anything exists rather than nothing. God's the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. God's the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe, for intelligent life. God's the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. And I found very often just listing the arguments is sufficient for the unbeliever without even sharing them. Finally, the last point would be, then learn some Christian evidences as well. Not just arguments for God's existence, but why think that the gospel records of Jesus of Nazareth are historically reliable? Why are these different than mythology or fairy tales? And by being thus equipped, I think you will be ready to be used of God in the lives of unbelievers that you meet. The Scripture says, always be prepared to give a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the reason of the hope that is in you. So preparation is key.
I just jump in for a second because this morning I discovered from Dr. Craig that we both, at a key moment in our lives, were very influenced by arguments for God's existence. So when you were a young student at Wheaton College and had heard from your professors, these things have all been debunked. But then you read more deeply in that area and it kind of awakened a new sensibility. When I was 14 years old, I came of age in the period after Vatican II, and we did not put a great stress on things like arguments for God's existence. But I was taught one of Thomas Aquinas' arguments. I'm a 14-year-old kid, Catholic, going to Mass on Sunday, but I wasn't particularly interested in religion. But that argument awakened something in my mind and set me on this path, which has led me to where I'm sitting right now. So I think the appeal to the mind is a very powerful thing, and we underplayed it for a long time. And in both our lives, it made a big difference, these rational arguments. So we shouldn't dismiss them, but we should incorporate them. You're quite right. Have them in the arsenal.
Yeah.
Can I follow up? I was going to ask Bishop Barron a follow-up question.
Yeah.
You mentioned what I think you referred to as a self-actualization culture. Am I getting the
Self-definition.
Self-definition, right.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask is what you maybe elaborate on that and speak to what you think the origins of that might be, where it came from, and how Christians might respond to it. And is it something that can be responded to in a rational way, or is it below that level? It's something deeper going on.
No, I think it's both. And if I were to trace it more intellectually, go back to someone like Nietzsche in the 19th century, where the will to power, and will is more important than value, than truth. It comes up in the 20th century, certainly in Sartre. Where in Sartre, existence precedes essence. So my freedom comes first, then I determine who I am. And those were high-level philosophical debates in the 19th and 20th centuries, but they trickled down, it seems to me. So there's the intellectual side. Through all kinds of classrooms and so on, it trickled down so that now it's the common philosophy of a lot of younger people. My way of trying to battle that is to say, in any area of life that you take seriously, you tend not to adopt that sort of philosophy. What I mean is, if you're really serious about playing the piano or swinging a golf club well, you're not going to say, it's just a matter of my will. I'll play any way I want. Any golfers can tell me how that goes, right? So when you really care about something, you want to submit your freedom to certain norms. But somehow when it comes to religion or the ultimate values, we say, oh, no, don't do that. You decide what they are. But see, that makes life dull, the same way it makes your golf poor. It makes your piano playing poor when your will and freedom are paramount. I think, especially in the area of religion, that when we submit ourselves to these great values and they shape our freedom, then we begin to live.
In the couple of minutes we have left, I'd like to get Jesus into the picture. Here's how. Let's imagine a thought experiment. Suppose somebody knocks on your door and says, well, I'm from a foreign country. I'm very interested in the religions of this country. I don't know anything about Christianity. Could you tell me, please, what Christianity is? Now, I don't know about you guys, but if it was me, obviously I don't know where the conversation would go and how long it would last, but I know very well what my first line would be. It would be, let me tell you about this person whose name is Jesus. Now, I'm wondering whether either of you guys want to riff on that. I think evangelism crucially involves telling people about Jesus Christ.
Oh. Yeah.
Well, that's what I meant when I said to have a gospel presentation. And we've actually had that experience, Steve. My wife, Jan, met some people in the grocery store from Switzerland. And she got striking up a conversation with them and invited them over to our house. And we began to talk about Christ. And they told us, our friends said, when you go to the United States, Americans will have you over and want to tell you about Jesus. And so they were waiting for this, and very receptive. So when you share something like, again, I go back to the 4 spiritual laws, the third law is that Jesus Christ is God's solution to man's predicament, which is sin and alienation. And through him, we can know and experience God's wonderful plan for our lives. So absolutely focus on Christ.
All right.
And that's where your personal testimony can come in and share how he changed your life.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
If my interlocutor spoke Latin by any chance, I would say, Deus fit homo ut homo fieret Deus.
Yeah.
So the church fathers, and they repeat it over and over again, when they were asked to sum up Christianity, said that. They said, God became human, that humans might become God, meaning sharers in God's nature. And that was their way of summing up the whole of Christianity. God became one of us that we might be drawn up into God's life. Right. So that's telling the story of Jesus. If you want the details, then look at the story of Jesus. But that's the essence of Christianity, I would say, is deification. The Greek fathers talk about theosis, right? Becoming deified. I think that's the goal. And there's no greater humanism on offer. There never has been. There never can be a greater humanism on offer than that God wants to draw us up into his own life. That's Christianity.
Bishop, as a Presbyterian, I have noticed, watching some of your programs, which I love, that you put great emphasis on beauty as a way of drawing people to the church.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether you'd want to talk about that. We know that's not to exclude rational arguments, which you are very good at, but I'm wondering if you would like to talk about that a bit.
I would, because the three great transcendentals, the philosophers told us, the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? Wherever you find being, you're going to find those three things. And a lot of our theology is focused on the good, think of the moral life and so on. A lot of it's focused on the true. But I think especially today, in our postmodern time, the good and the true can be non-starters for a lot of people. Because if I say to you, now here's the way you ought to behave. Let me tell you what's the good life. Well, people's defenses go up. If I say, look, I got the truth that you need to know, they get defensive. But the beautiful, I think, is just a little bit more winsome for a lot of people. I'm not going to tell you what to think yet. I'm not going to tell you how to behave yet. But just look at this. Let me just show you something. And as a Catholic, I would say, we can draw on the great aesthetic tradition. Look at the Sistine Chapel. I'm not going to tell you yet what to think or how to behave, but look at that. Let me explain it to you. Listen to Mozart Mass. Listen to Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. Look at the work of Mother Teresa's sisters in Calcutta. The beautiful, I think, can be a winsome way in toward the good and the true, when the good and the true can send up the hackles,
Very good. Any last thoughts from either of you on evangelism before we turn it over to Ed?
Well, I said that the second point is to make our culture more receptive to the gospel. Even if Christians are sharing their faith more readily, if our culture is increasingly hostile, that's going to cause resistance. And it seems to me that we need to identify those factors shaping American culture which make it hardened to the gospel. And I can think of three things. One would be we need to impact the American university. The American university is the most important institution shaping Western culture. And if Christianity can have a place of respect at the university, this will help to reshape our future teachers, future lawyers, future judges, and so forth. The second thing would be the entertainment industry. Although academics like to think that we're the ones who shape culture, I have a deep suspicion that in fact it's really film and music and television that shapes our culture. And these industries are so filled with anti-Christian values of sexual promiscuity, hedonism, and selfishness, that we need a new generation of Christian filmmakers and musicians and so forth who can help to impact this area for Christ. And finally, I think we need to reform the U.S. judiciary. We are living under a judicial system that has sanctioned a holocaust against babies in utero for decades now, resulting in the loss of millions of lives. A Supreme Court that on the basis of 5 judges has redefined marriage in such a way that traditional marriage no longer has it as part of its essence, that it's heterosexual. Religious liberty and civil liberties, I think, are under threat. And I think that President Trump's appointment of Neil Gorsuch is perhaps a bellwether that there is possibility here for real change over the next 8 years in our judicial system. And if this happens, I think it could have a tremendous impact in making American culture more sympathetic and open to the gospel.
Okay. Ed, it's all yours. Second topic.
I think Bishop Barron, I don't know if Bishop Barron, we've got 5 minutes left in this segment, is that right? Okay, yeah, so maybe Bishop Barron wanted to speak to the same question.
Sorry, yeah.
Maybe I'd say this, that Christians have to know there's an appropriate rhythm between what I call hunkering down and going forth. We do have to hunker down sometimes when the culture becomes very hostile, and we have to learn our own stuff. And there's where the study of the faith comes in, the study of the scriptures, the great philosophical and theological traditions, the artistic tradition. Here I think of the young Karol Wojtyła. To go back to the 30s, when the Nazis overrun Poland, what did he do? He and his friends hunkered down, and they recited together the great works of Polish literature, which are much more than Polish literature. They carried in many ways the Christian faith. And they hid behind locked doors and closed windows, and many of them were killed during that time. They hunkered down, but then fast forward several decades, and now that young kid, grown up to be Pope John Paul II, boldly comes forth and prompts a revolution. You know, when he gives that famous speech in 1979 in Victory Square in Poland, and the people would just begin to chant, "We want God, we want God." And what I find so powerful there is it was the young kid that hunkered down and learned and preserved the great tradition who was then able to bring it forth, you know. So to know that rhythm, when I was coming of age, we were all on go out and meet the culture, go out and meet the world. That's fine, but if you don't hunker down and learn the tradition, you've got little to bring to the world, and soon you just become a sort of echo, a faint echo of it. So the hunkering down, but I think of the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who said, we're not meant to live behind Chinese walls, was the way he put it. We're meant to go out. We're an evangelical community. So that's the rhythm, and it's hard to get right. But the rhythm of drawing in and learning and studying and praying and preserving, and then going out with confidence to meet the culture.
All right, so we're going to turn now to address the topic of science and faith for a few minutes. And Bishop Barron had mentioned scientism as an ingredient of the hostility to Christianity that exists in modern Western society. Scientism, the idea that science alone gives us knowledge, we could characterize as a key ingredient of the new atheist criticism of religion, which you've both spoken about in your work. So you get in Richard Dawkins, of course, the idea that Christianity has been falsified, religion in general has been falsified by Darwinism, that Darwinism provides a superior explanation, scientific explanation, to anything that religion could afford. You find in Lawrence Krauss the idea that physics can give us an answer to the question why anything exists at all rather than nothing, and so forth. But it's not just new atheists and other aggressive critics of religion who take this sort of view. We find this really in the culture at large. I think even in writers and just the average man on the street who isn't necessarily viscerally hostile to religion, but buys this idea that there's some conflict between science and religion. So what I want to ask is, how do we get to this point? Why is it that people have this idea? Where did it come from? And how can it be rooted out? And I want to put that question first to Professor Craig, and then Bishop Barron can speak to that.
I think you're absolutely right, Ed, in saying that our culture remains deeply scientistic and modernist in its heart. And I think it is the lingering vestige of a movement in philosophy during the 1930s and 40s called positivism, which championed a verification principle of meaning, which said unless something is scientifically provable, then it is meaningless. And therefore, theological talk, ethics, aesthetics, these are all cognitively empty. They are meaningless because they can't be scientifically verified. And I think the scientism that persists on the popular level is the lingering shadow of this defunct positivism. And I say it's defunct because among philosophers, this was shown to be untenable decades ago. And it's very easy to see. Just ask yourself, take the proposition, you should only believe things that can be scientifically proven. Can that be scientifically proven? Well, obviously not. It's just a mere assertion which you're free to reject. And so it was realized that the verification principle of meaning was self-refuting and therefore could not be held. And so this kind of verificationism and scientism has been abandoned among professional philosophers, but it is shocking how it lingers in certain scientists that you've named, as well as in pop culture.
Yeah, no, quite right. It's a philosophical position, so it's self-refuting, as Dr. Craig says. I mean, it's the one thing you can't say about a philosophical position is that it's outlawed by philosophy. I mean, so it turns on itself, scientism. I mean, I think where it comes from is the success of the sciences. Scientists have been remarkably successful, and then the attendant technology has been so useful to us that we just by a basic instinct say, well, this is it. This is verifiable. This is right in front of me. I can use it. But see, go right back to Plato. You know, we all read in Philosophy 101, Plato's Republic and the escape from the cave. You know, that there's these different levels of knowledge. And to stay simply at the level of sense experience is to stay at that level of seeing shadows in the wall of the cave. They're real and important, but there's a far greater dimension of reality beyond what can just be seen and measured empirically. And I think in some ways we've just locked ourselves into that very narrow epistemological space. And the great thing that Plato recounts is a kind of like a conversion story. What's it like when you're able finally to escape from the cave and come to higher levels of perception? Philosophy, for example, is just a different way of seeing the world. It's seeing at different levels. One of my great mentors, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, used to say, the collapse of philosophy in many ways has produced the problem. Because now there's a binary option in the minds of many. There's science, which is obviously true and verifiable. Then there's religion, which is not scientific, therefore it must just be a bunch of nonsense. When there was a mediating discipline of philosophy that was not scientific, but was rational, people said, oh, okay, I understand that. And it opened the door toward a rational consideration of religion. And I've always felt that's right. But we've locked ourselves in the cave, and maybe because of the success of the sciences, but what an impoverishment of our intellectual lives. You know? That's what I worry about with the scientism, is the buffered self that Charles Taylor talks about. We've just locked ourselves in, and any sense of a transcendent dimension is lost.
I think Ed Feser has shared the most powerful illustration of this that I've just got to share with the audience. He says, imagine that you have got a super duper metal detector that is so highly honed that it will detect any metal. It is absolutely fantastic. And can you imagine someone using this? You know, I've not found any wooden objects using this thing. I don't think wood exists. There aren't any wooden objects because of this metal detector. That's like natural science. It's a great tool for exploring the physical world. But that doesn't mean that there aren't minds, ethical values, spiritual things. It's like your metal detector.
That's a brilliant example.
It is. It's the best I've heard.
Well, now, both of your comments lead me to ask the follow-up question. What then is the relationship between science on the one hand and apologetics and theology on the other? Should we say then that the methodology of apologetics and of what used to be called fundamental theology should be something independent of science? Does it lie in philosophy alone? Or does science, as science, have something to say to apologetics and to theology? Is it a mix? Can we apply both methods? What's the relationship between them? And I guess we go to Bishop Barron first and then Professor Craig.
Well, you're pointing to the problem of faith and reason, to put it more generally. And, the Catholic tradition certainly, and Dr. Craig holds this as well, of course, that both come from the same source, God ultimately, both lead back to God. And so when they're properly construed, there's no conflict between them. Reason carries you to a certain point. And then there's this wonderful surrender of the Spirit that we call faith, which is not, and I keep insisting on this, is not infra-rational, it's supra-rational, right? It's not lower than reason. No self-respecting Christian should ever accept things that are lower than reason. That's the merely superstitious. That's what credulous people believe. But faith, supra-rational, that goes beyond what reason can grasp on its own, that's not in conflict with reason, but it's a complement to it. And the best analogy I have for that is coming to know a person. If you're coming to know a person, you use your reason in all sorts of ways, don't you? Your own observations, your own analysis, talking to people that know that person. You might Google that person, find their background, etc. Then you come to know them through conversation. Reason plays a very important role. And if you were never using your reason in coming to know a person, that would be problematic. However, there comes a point in any really deep friendship where that person is now going to open her heart to you and tell you something that you would never have gotten on your own observation or from a Google search or from talking to other people. It's a self-disclosure. And at that point, you've got to make a decision. Do I believe her or not? Do I accept this? Now, if she's saying something that's totally out of step with what your reason has told you, then you might not accept it. But if it's congruent with it, but going beyond it, and you've learned to trust that person, you're likely to say, yes, I believe you. And to my mind, that's a very close analogy to the play of faith and reason when it comes to God. We use our reason in all sorts of ways to understand God. And to use the sciences, sure, and philosophy, of course. But there comes this moment when I'm faced with a choice. Do I accept what God has disclosed to me from his own heart? And that acceptance, above reason, not below it, that's faith. So that's the general answer to the kind of the faith-reason thing. Maybe you say more about science. That's a general response.
Yes, may I? I think that in apologetics, what we want to avoid, Ed, is God of the gaps arguments, where we say, science can't explain this, therefore God did it.
Right.
And God gets gradually squeezed out as science advances. Rather, here's the way I would put it. Science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to a conclusion of theological significance. Science can provide evidence for a premise in an argument leading to a conclusion of theological significance. So, for example, in the Kalam cosmological argument, the second premise is the universe began to exist. Now, that is a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics, and one which enjoys a good deal of scientific support. And so one is not using God of the gaps reasoning. You're using evidence to support a premise in an argument that has a theistic conclusion.
Okay, so we've been talking about science and faith in a very general way. There are also those specific issues that come up where the question of the relationship between science and religion are concerned. So, some examples. Famously, there's this idea in modern times that Darwinism, that Darwin's account of evolution by natural selection is somehow incompatible, essentially incompatible with the claims of Christian theology. So what should a Christian, one question we might address would be what need a Christian believe about human origins, and how can it be reconciled, or should it be reconciled with what modern biology tells us? That's one question. Another question has to do with the specific origins of modern science in the Western context. It arose in a Christian context. Why is that? Probably the standard narrative is that it arose as a reaction against Christianity, and that science is essentially a rejection of superstitions that Western culture had been enthralled to for the Middle Ages. On the other hand, there's another narrative that says no, that it's no accident that science arose in a Christian context as opposed to an Islamic context or a Chinese context or what have you, and that there's something in Christianity itself that lends itself to science. So these are a couple issues. There are many others. And so what might you say to some or any or all of these questions, or maybe some other ones that you think are especially important where science and faith are concerned?
Well, maybe I'll take the second one first, about the origins of science. I believe this is a very important thing because modernity, as it were, has to trot out that story over and over again like a myth of origin. That the sciences and then liberal politics, you might say, emerged out of this long twilight struggle against backward-looking Christianity. And so you hear that over and over again in the culture. It's like we have to tell that story to ourselves over and again. But I think that's so much nonsense. I think it's quite right to say that the modern physical sciences emerged where and when they did because of a Christian intellectual matrix. And what I mean is this. I think there are two basic things you need to get the sciences off the ground. You need the view that the world is not God. The world is divine, or the world itself is sacred. You're not going to analyze it and experiment on it and so on. You're going to worship it or you're reverence it. The world is not God. Secondly, the very mystical intuition that the world in every nook and cranny is intelligible. Now, mind you, I'm not talking about intelligent design here. I'm talking about something more fundamental. The intelligibility of the world. So any scientist of any stripe, physicist, chemist, biologist, psychologist, goes out to meet a world that she is confident is going to be intelligible. It'll correspond to an inquiring mind. There's some intelligibility that corresponds to a questing intelligence. But see, that's a very strange and mystical thing the more you think about it. Why should that be the case? So take those two things now. What's the condition for their possibility? I would say the great doctrine of creation. If the world is created, it's not divine. It's not sacred. It's not there to be worshipped. It's a creature. And if it's created, it's marked in every corner by intelligibility. So we would say, in the beginning was the Word, And through that word, all things came to be. It means God, metaphorically, spoke the world into being. I think here of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, who loved to reflect on our little strange word to recognize. When I recognize a truth, I recognize it. So I think again what's already been thought into it. So I think that is not the least bit accidental, that out of this Christian thought matrix, the first natural sciences in the West, physical sciences, emerged. And so it's not a story of great conflict. I think it's a story of great mutuality, witnessed to by the fact that almost all the great founders of the modern sciences were people of authentic religious faith. So I think we need to tell that story over and over again because the culture is constantly telling the other myth of origin.
With respect to the first question concerning the biological theory of evolution, what I tell unbelievers who ask me about this is that there are indications in the text of Genesis 1 itself that this is not intended to be a literal consecutive 24-hour creation week. And that therefore we do not need to interpret this along these sorts of literalistic lines. And once you give up that notion, then it really doesn't tell you anything about how God created life forms on this planet. Indeed, when he creates the vegetation, it's very interesting. On the fourth day, he says, let the earth bring forth vegetation bearing seed after its kind and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind. And it was so, the earth brought forth vegetation and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind. Now, unless we're to envision this like a film being run on fast forward, where the apple tree suddenly springs out of the dirt and grows up and turns into a big tree and the apples pop out on it, well, then this must have taken a good deal of time. So I don't think the author of Genesis 1 is imagining that his narrative is like a film running on fast forward. And once you give a notion of a literal 24-hour day creation week, then all bets are off about how God brought about biological complexity. And so I tell folks, and I mean this quite sincerely, that I have about current evolutionary theory are scientific doubts, not theological doubts. My reservations about the current theory of biological evolution would be based upon the inadequacy of the explanatory mechanisms, but I have no theological or biblical objection to the theory. So as a Christian, you're open to follow the evidence where it leads. You can be open-minded and follow that evidence. And I remember sharing once with a kid in Ireland about the gospel, and he said, don't you have to believe that the world was created in 6 days to be a Christian? I said, you don't have to believe that to be a Christian. And he threw his hands in the air and said, hallelujah! This kid had been prevented from giving his life to Christ because he thought he had to jump through the hoop of young earth creationism in order to become a Christian. And he was so happy to hear that he didn't have to do that. So, Alvin Plantinga said it's really the evolutionist who's in the box here, or the naturalist rather, because if naturalism is true, then evolution has to be true. There isn't any other source. But the Christian can be open-minded about it, and we can follow the evidence where it leads.
Here's one really quick question. We've just got 2 minutes left. There is in biology a group of people called the Origin of Life Society. And of course, originally the idea is we've got rocks and galaxies and maybe planets and so forth. And now we've got the inorganic, and now we've got the organic. Would it be a problem for Christians if they could come up with a plausible way of explaining how the inorganic led to life? Now, whether they can do that is a very good question. And I sort of hope they can't. But at any rate, would that be a problem for Christians if they had a plausible story? And we've just got 1 minute left. So
1 minute.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. And I think the bottom line from a, let's say, Christian anthropological standpoint is I think we have to hold about human beings, there's more to us than simply the biological or the material.
Yeah.
There's something in us. I'll call what you want, soul, consciousness, spirit, mind, but something which is not reducible to the merely biological or physical. Now, how you account for that, that's another question. But the question, I agree with Dr. Craig, of evolution itself and the biological development of the species, I leave that to the specialists. I think we do have to hang on to something like the soul, something that's non-reducible to the merely physical. There's a bottom line. But in terms of the development of things, I agree. Follow the evidence that's offered to us.
So yes, we're going to turn it over to you, Steve, for our next segment.
We'll do it a little bit differently this segment, only 10 minutes. We're going to ask each of our panelists here to speak for 5 minutes about this topic. What advice would you give to Christians, like the people we see out there, living in an increasingly secular world? And it certainly seems, unless all signs mislead, this country is going to be as secular as some of the most secular countries in Europe. And teaching in secular academia, as I do, it's you certainly see this all the time. How should Christians deal with this world? Should we fight against it? Should we go along with it? What should we do? I've forgotten which one I was supposed to begin with. I think, Bill, it was going to be you.
Okay. I want to admonish you tonight to dare to live counterculturally. When I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, everyone talked about the counterculture. I think Christians ought to be the genuine countercultural people. We need to dare to be different. You've all heard the story about the frog slowly being boiled to death in the kettle. That's the danger, I think, that we face in our society. American society and culture is so poisonous to Christian faith that if you feel comfortable in American culture, there is something wrong with your discipleship, frankly. A Christian who is committed to following Christ seriously ought to feel very uncomfortable in this culture, particularly with its materialism and consumerism and focus on the acquisition of goods. And I hope that you young couples here tonight won't make it your focus to have a big house and fancy car and nice furniture and those sorts of things the world values, but will instead focus on living for Christ and using your resources as good stewards of the Lord's work. Our culture is permeated by sexual license and promiscuity. And I think as Christians, we must preserve the sanctity of the marriage relationship, that we do not have sexual activity before or outside of the marriage bond that God has established for us. And that is living counterculturally today. And then finally, just the superficiality and the banality of American culture, which is so focused on celebrities and sports and entertainment and so forth. I would encourage you as a Christian to go beyond that and to think deeply about the important issues of life, like you're doing here tonight by attending this sort of event. That is already being countercultural. The second thing I'd like to encourage is to train your children carefully to be Christians in our culture. We mustn't hand our children over to our public grade schools and high schools to be raised. We need at home, and this is especially you dads, you need to be teaching your children why they believe and what we believe from a young age, simple at first, but then with increasing sophistication as they grow older. Otherwise, we are in danger of losing our youth. We will lose the next generation, and none of you, I think, wants that to happen. So be very intentional about training your children in what and why we believe as we do as Christians.
I'd like to say amen to all of that. Just your last point about the young people, this is a passion of mine, because this problem of the nuns, they call it now in the technical language, not the N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S, those who mark no religion or none when they ask what their religion is. And that number is increasing dramatically. The one that always gets my attention is among Catholics, 30 and younger. Now it's 50% claim to be nuns, to have no religion. That's heartbreaking, and that's a very troubling thing for our whole, not just the church, but for the whole culture, I think. So I agree with that. I mean, to really be attentive to our kids. Here's a couple of things I would add. One is what I call the Augustinian anthropology. So the single greatest statement of Christian anthropology is on page 1 of Augustine's Confessions, right? Lord, you've made us for yourself. Therefore, our heart is restless until it rests in thee. I think every sermon of Billy Graham had that basic structure. Bruce Springsteen said it, everyone's got a hungry heart, right? You can see it echoing up and down the high and low culture across the centuries. There's a longing in us, which is a longing for God. C.S. Lewis calls that joy, that strange, even at the best moments of life, maybe especially in the best moments of life, our times of greatest joy and achievement and friendship and so on. It's at those moments that you realize the hungry heart, that there's still something more that I want, right? And don't let that hungry heart be suppressed, because one of the marks of secularism, I think, is just that, is to say, oh, just cover that over. Don't pay attention to that. That's just the old, some psychological hang-up. No, that's what makes us most alive, is to follow that hunger. And it presses the mind onward. That's why I'm against the new atheists, because not that they're opening up the mind, they're shutting down the mind. Scientism shuts down the mind. Naturalism shuts down the mind. And don't shut down the heart, the longing for the good and for the true and the beautiful. Religion is meant to make the spirit soar. Lord, our heart is restless. Get in touch with the restless heart. And teach your kids that too. That when they experience that, that's an experience of the call of God, and only God can satisfy that hunger. So I think that's really important in our own spiritual cultivation. And then this relates very much to what Dr. Craig said too. Hans Urs von Balthasar, one of my favorite contemporary theologians, said the saints are the best theologians and evangelists. And that's dead right, I think. I mean, we all speculate theologically about things, but the best theologians are the saints, the ones who are in love with Christ and live out of that love. And they have a radiant power, don't they? That's why we surround them with light in our depictions of them. They have a radiance. So be a saint. If you want to evangelize the culture, be a saint. Be holy. Give your life to Christ and let people see it. So the hungry heart and be a saint are two bits of advice I would have.
Got like 3. Okay. So both of you are very prominent Christian apologists. And what role, just to round out this segment, what role do you think that apologetics, traditionally, a foundational discipline within theology, which has perhaps been neglected until the work of writers like yourselves, what role does it play in this evangelization that you're discussing? Starting with Professor Craig, maybe briefly, and then Bishop Barron briefly.
I think we're living in an age in which there is a renaissance of Christian apologetics, and people in our churches are demanding training in apologetics. It's not coming from the top down, it's coming from the grassroots, and this is very encouraging to me. It seems to me that training in apologetics is useful for at least 3 purposes. The first one is shaping culture. We need to shape our culture, as I say, so as to make the acceptance of the gospel something more than a logical absurdity. And apologetics can help to shape a cultural milieu in which the decision to follow Christ is a rational thing for a thinking man or woman to do. People may not become Christians because of the arguments, but the arguments can give them permission to believe when their hearts are moved. Secondly, I think that apologetics is useful to the Christian believer in times of doubt and struggle. There have been so many Christians who have come to me or emailed Reasonable Faith who said, I had walked away from my faith in college, or I had walked away from Christ, and then I saw a video of a debate, or I read a book, and it has re-energized their faith, and they have come back strong to Christ and living for him. And so when we're going through difficult times of doubt or questioning, rehearsing the arguments and the evidence can be a strengthening part of the Christian life to help us to persevere. And then finally, I do think it is useful in evangelism. People say, people never come to Christ through arguments. Well, that's just false. It's just not true. We get emails every week at Reasonable Faith from people who say, I saw your videos on the ontological argument or the cosmological argument, and they've come to know Christ through these. It's just astonishing. So with a minority of people who are intellectually seeking and have genuine difficulties, apologetics is one of the means that the Holy Spirit uses to draw people to himself.
Bishop Barron, do you have some remarks?
I'll tell a quick story. This is now maybe 10 years ago at the height of the New Atheist thing. And I was being interviewed by a radio interviewer from Canada. And he was being kind of tough with me and belligerent and rehearsing all the Hitchens arguments, and I'm fighting back. And at the end he said, well, now, Father, at least will you admit that Christopher Hitchens got you Catholics thinking about these things for the first time? So I paused to let my annoyance, sink in. And then I said to him, I'm the very inadequate representative of a tradition that goes back to Origen and Tertullian and Thomas Aquinas and Anselm. I said, trust me, we didn't need Christopher Hitchens to get us to think about it. But I'll say this, in a way, and I mentioned to Dr. Craig earlier today, Hitchens did, I think, in God's providence, perform a service, because the New Atheists, precisely in their extremism and in their rhetorical, overkill, did wake Christians up and remind us of the need for apologetics. When I was coming of age as a post-conciliar Catholic, we were down on apologetics. Apologetics was rationalistic, it was defensive, it was anti-ecumenical, it wouldn't bring anyone to Christ. I heard all those things growing up. Well, in a way, thank God for Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris, because they woke us up and said, get with it. We dropped all the weapons, and so when they came after us, a lot of Christians weren't able to respond. I think I'm sitting next to one of the heroes, I think, of this great Renaissance and revival. But I think that's been a great thing for the Christian churches, so I'm pro-apologetics.
All right, so we're going to move on now to our next segment, which is Q&A based on questions submitted by our audience members. We want to thank all of you who submitted questions. We got a lot of questions, and unfortunately we won't be able to address all of them. We're going to try to get through as many as we can. And Steve Davis is going to start us off with the first question.
Bishop Barron, do you think that Catholics and Protestants joining to battle secularism will bring them closer together?
Yeah. I've been involved in... Yeah. I've been involved in a lot of ecumenical conversations over the years, and I love the questions of the 16th century. So the reformers raised all these objections, and Catholics responded, and I find those questions fascinating, so I love debating them. But at the end of these ecumenical conversations, I almost always say to my Protestant interlocutors, we could discuss this till the cows come home, but we got a common enemy today, which is a very aggressive secularism. And so our priority should be, right now, not debating justification and all that. We should talk about God and talk about Jesus Christ and talk about eternal life, and we can come together and fight in a common struggle against that enemy. So yes, I think it's a call of our time.
It'll be Ed's turn next, but I should have said that came from Sean, and that question came on Twitter.
Okay, good.
All right, so our next question is from Carol via Facebook, and this one is addressed to both of you. And the question is, what would you say is your favorite argument for God? And I think we'll go with Professor Craig first.
My favorite argument is the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. What could be more simple? But while this is my favorite argument, I must confess that it's not necessarily the most effective of the arguments. I find that the moral argument is far more effective, because you can shut your eyes to the evidence of contemporary cosmology. You can ignore the fine-tuning of the universe. But every day you get up, you answer by how you live the question, do you think other people have intrinsic and objective moral worth? So this argument is existentially inescapable, and I think it's the most powerful.
Bishop Barron?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I was teaching theology full-time, I love the ontological argument. I think it does have validity if it's properly presented. But I hardly ever do that in an apologetic setting, because I think it's too complex to lay it out properly. So I use some version of the argument from contingency a lot. And I think that has a good deal of traction. The Kalam argument, in some ways, is a modality of that. But that things exist, but not self-explanatorily. They exist only through appeal to an extrinsic cause. We can't go infinitely back with caused causes. There must be a first uncaused cause. I usually give some quick version of that argument to get some traction with people. And I found over the years that does have a lot of apologetic effectiveness. So I'd say, in itself, the ontological argument, but the contingency argument is one that I like best.
This one comes from Allison on Twitter, and it also is addressed to both of you. Besides you two men, who else do you see as effectively doing this work of evangelism today?
There's no one, really. I'm joking. Go ahead, Eric.
There are lots of people doing this. Lee Strobel's books, Case for Christ, Case for Faith, and now even the movie, The Case for Christ, has reached hundreds of thousands of people. Lee told me he's lost count of the number of people that have come to Christ through his books. Ravi Zacharias has a ministry that has a worldwide reach, emphasizing apologetics and evangelism. Greg Kokel's ministry, Stand to Reason, is excellent. And if you've ever seen Greg's book called Tactics, it's a wonderful book about sharing your faith effectively with non-believers. Now, I'm sure I'm forgetting some, and I hope I've just not slighted any of my friends, but I mean, there are many others. Frank Turek, Hugh Ross, Tim Keller deserves mention here. His books, The Reason for God, and his videos have had a tremendous influence. So there are lots of folks that, thank God, are engaged in this kind of ministry.
And I'll mention a couple on the Catholic side. Peter Kraft, I think,
Yes.
is a
Yeah,
wonderful
absolutely.
apologist, evangelist. I think, too, of Robert Pitzer is out this way. He's in Anaheim. Does wonderful work with cosmology and the sciences from a very smart, very high-level apologetics, I would say. So those are a couple that come right to my mind.
Good.
All right, so we turn to a question from Ben via Instagram, and this is once again addressed to both of you. The question is, which thinkers or theologians have most influenced you? We'll start with Professor Craig and then move to Bishop Barron.
The greatest influence on me has been the American Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga. I thank God to have lived during the time that Alvin Plantinga was writing and flourishing. I think this man will go down as a Leibniz in the history of philosophy. Every area that he's touched, the problem of evil, the nature of necessity, the ontological argument, religious epistemology, he has broken new ground and advanced the discipline. And at the same time, he has been a beacon that has served as a rallying point for hundreds of other Christian philosophers to come out of the closet, to be involved in professional societies, professional journals, academic presses. And Plantinga has greatly influenced me in both his writing and content and also in the example of his gracious Christian life.
Yeah, for me, historically, it's Thomas Aquinas is the biggest impact. He changed my life when I was a kid, and I spent most of my life studying him and writing about him. So Aquinas, certainly. I'd say St. Augustine. And the older I get, the more I appreciate Augustine. I read the Confessions as often as I can, so he had a huge impact on me. Among more contemporary people, I'd mention G.K. Chesterton was a very important player in my own intellectual development. Also, John Henry Newman from the 19th century. Again, someone very involved in what we call today probably apologetics and so on. I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis, had a big impact on me. Among my teachers, a fellow from Catholic University called Robert Sokolowski, wonderful professor I had, a bit there like Alvin Plantinga for you, that he modeled for me kind of a Christian gentleman, and his thought had a big impact on me. Those are a few that come to my mind.
This one comes from Betty on Twitter, and again, it's for both of you. What would you identify as the number one thing Christians should study today to be prepared for the next several decades?
Well, we're talking, I assume here, Steve, about the average Christian layperson and not someone who wants to go into an area of specialization, an academic field. And I guess, is the question in terms of the most important for evangelization or just for...
That isn't what Betty has to say. What would you identify as the number one thing Christians should study today to be prepared for the next several decades? I don't know.
It's going to sound obvious, but it would be the New Testament.
Yeah.
Where Christians are, sadly, biblically illiterate. And I think that Christians need to get past simply reading the Bible and to begin really studying the Bible. And there are wonderful helps, Bible dictionaries, commentaries, and things of this sort to help us go deep into the Scriptures. And that would be the most important thing that we can do.
Yeah, and let me follow up on that, because I think that gets overlooked sometimes when we talk about apologetics. But evangelization, declaring the lordship of Jesus, you can't do that apart from the story of Israel. Because to say Jesus Christ is Lord means he's the culmination of this great story. He's the fulfillment of Torah and temple and prophecy and so on. He makes no sense apart from Israel. Look at the first evangelists doing their work. Paul and the very first proclaimers of the Christian message, they tell the story of Israel because he's the climax of it. And so without that, we're not going to evangelize. And that's why Jesus becomes, in our culture, very often, a sort of guru or a sage or a teacher of timeless truths. But he's the fulfillment of Israel. And until we get that right, we're not going to get him right. So I think that's correct. Vatican II, the Catholics know, called for a biblical revival. And in my judgment, it hasn't happened. It's one of the unfulfilled promises of Vatican II. So I would say, yeah, if Catholics could pick up their Bibles and read them and study them, that's key for evangelization.
Would this idea get any traction, that what Christians need to study, like in the university or something, would be science? Because we need a lot more Christian scientists, and we need a lot more Christians who are educated in the sciences.
Yeah, I think that's right, too. And something I've been doing recently, because, the studies are showing number one reason the young kids are leaving, science and religion are incompatible. Number one reason. So I've been, when I give talks now and I go out to Catholic parishes, I'll say, how many here are involved in the sciences? Raise your hand, doctors, nurses, or, physicists, chemists. And a lot of hands go up, as they are now. And I'll say, you get out there. We need you. Scientists who are still coming to Mass, you be in the front lines, because the kids are leaving, they don't get this connection. And you'll make it better probably than I will. So I think that's a very good point, that the study of the sciences is key.
I want to pick up on something, though, that Bishop Barron said, Steve, about this, and that is that the link between the sciences and theology is philosophy.
Yep.
And so it is not enough just to study science in textbooks. You read things, for example, like special relativity theory, general relativity theory. These involve deep philosophical questions that aren't discussed in the science textbooks. And so the key issues in relating science to religion or theology will be philosophical. And so you've got to get some training in that third discipline as well.
Okay.
All right. Our next question is a tweet. It's not from whom you think.
Oh, yeah.
This came in.
The tweet. Tweeter in chief.
This is via Twitter, and it's from Alex, and it's a two-part question. What do you consider the best argument against Christianity, and how would you respond to it? And I will leave that to whoever wants to go first. This is directed to both of you.
I think the best argument against God is the problem of evil. And I want to be careful with this because, in a way, the argument is not rationally all that strong, but it's got enormous emotional power. And I think for a lot of people, that's a very persuasive thing.
Sorry.
How could the all good God permit something like that to happen?
That was not scripted.
So I think that's the one that people, in my experience, struggle with the most, is the viscerally felt problem of suffering. Again, I say it from a logical standpoint, I don't think it's a very persuasive argument.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's an emotionally powerful argument for people. So engaging them around that, I think, is an important one.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. This is just a very difficult question. I agree with you that the force of the problem of evil is just emotional. As an intellectual problem, I think it's been solved largely through the work of Christian philosophers today. One of the unsolved objections that troubled me was the challenge of Platonism. That is to say, that there is a realm of uncreated, necessarily existent, eternal, abstract objects like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities, possible worlds, properties, propositions, and so forth. And this called into question God's being the sole ultimate reality and the creator of all being outside himself. And I did not know how to answer that objection. It troubled me for many years, and finally, I made that the focus of my research, and I spent the last 13 years working on that, and I have come to intellectual peace about this issue and have written a pair of books in which I lay out Christian perspectives on Platonism and the challenge it poses to divine aseity. So that's not a problem now either.
Solve that one.
Here's a
Well, I had a follow. Were you going to follow up on this?
follow up on this, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let you go ahead with your follow-up, and then I'll follow up on your follow-up.
Here's a follow-up on the problem of evil. I actually agree with what the two of you said about the problem of evil as an intellectual problem and as a moral problem. I was once asked by a working man who was in the parish where I was working. I am an ordained minister, but I only worked about a year in the parish before becoming an academic. He had been diagnosed with lupus, disease for which then, and I think still today, there's no known cure, and eventually he did die. And he asked me the question, why did this happen to me? Now, he wasn't intellectually prepared to ask the problem of evil question, but nevertheless, that's a question that's part intellectual, part emotive. I guess I could ask, well, how would you respond to something like that?
Well, there's the pastoral level, and I, worked in parish, worked for a long time, worked in a seminary training students, and so you wouldn't, begin with intellectual clarification with someone there. There's a way, and that is not to trivialize at all that pastoral outreach is extremely important. I go back to the standard Augustinian solution of God permitting evil to bring about a greater good. Now what that greater good is, we can sometimes get a glimpse of, but typically not. And we see this little tiny swath of space and time that we take in. What God's ultimate purposes are, we can't see. But there's a faith move there. It's faith that's also grounded in philosophy, a philosophical perception, that God is permitting this suffering for a purpose of his own, which is a good purpose. And to help people move into that space. There's an intellectual side of it, but there's also this experiential side of it. And help them to inhabit that space of confidence in God's providence. I think that's the challenge. It's both intellectual and pastoral. But that's where I would try to move somebody.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly what I would have said too, is that we're not in a position to answer questions like that. because of our cognitive limitations, our limitations in time and space, God's allowing you to have lupus. The sufficient reason for why he permitted that might not emerge until hundreds of years from now, perhaps in another country, because of the ripple effect that it sends through history. And you can give some analogies for this, like in chaos theory. Scientists have shown that the palpitation of a butterfly's wings on a twig in the jungles in West Africa can set in motion forces that eventually cause a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. And yet no one looking at that butterfly would be able to predict such an outcome. We're overwhelmed by that sort of complexity. And so we can't expect to be able to see God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering that he does in our lives. But we can bear that suffering in courage and faith in him, knowing that we have good reasons to believe he exists and that there awaits us on the other side of life a glorious eternity of joy that will so overwhelm anything we've suffered here that they will be reduced to just an infinitesimal moment in comparison to this eternal joy that we will have with God in the afterlife.
Yeah, my own follow-up was by way of narrowing the question a bit. So you were both asked earlier, what was your favorite argument for the existence of God? So if we reframe this current question, I want to ask, what would you consider the most formidable, if any, objection to your favorite argument for God's existence, and how would you respond to that?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I said the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't think objections to the first premise have any intellectual substance. I think you're intellectually compromised if you assert that something can come into being uncaused from nothing. So it will be criticism of the second premise, and I think that the best response is simply to say, well, you know, the actual infinite is just really funny, is just really weird, and that's just the way it is, and just live with it.
You're talking about the premise that the universe
that an actual infinite number of things cannot exist, and therefore the past can't be actually infinite.
Right.
And one can point out all of the bizarre results if an actual infinite number of things could exist. And I think that the best response for that is just to bite the bullet and say, yeah, that's just the way it is. And then with regard to the scientific evidence, the appeal to ignorance is always available to the naturalist. Well, we just don't know enough. That maybe science will overturn the apple cart of the Big Bang Theory and the second law of thermodynamics and restore an eternal universe after all.
All right, Bishop Barron?
Yeah, I find with the contingency argument, I deal with it a lot on my internet ministry. And when you get some smart people who really get in there and want to argue with you, might say, no, I buy it logically. There has got to be some sort of starting point, some ultimate explanation for the to-be of contingent things. But why couldn't we say it's just matter or it's just energy? So what you're calling God, I'll just call matter that's always been there and just assuming different forms and so on. And of course, the problem with that, though, is that matter is, by its very nature, contingent. So I would use the classical philosophical language and say it's by its nature potential. That's to say, matter never exists as such, but matter always in a particular form or configuration or speed or intensity or color or position or whatever, which means that it needs to be explained. Why is it this rather than that? Why is it this intensity rather than that? This color rather than that? This position rather than that? Etc. So the appeal to matter or energy as such is not going to solve the problem, just postpones the problem. So that's how I think when the more thoughtful people start engaging around contingency, that's the way the argument often goes for me.
Moreover, if matter began to exist, then it cannot be necessarily existent.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, but and even like with the Kalam in mind, some of the people will say, well, it's not really matter coming into being from nothing, but rather this hyper-intense concentration of matter, which then by its energy explodes, right? And then it retracts. And what you always have is this concentration of matter.
But you don't always have it.
Yeah, I know. That's where
it's a boundary to time and space, so it's not always there.
It was one of the questions I was going to ask you in our interaction time. So
We'll come back.
I'm trying to be supportive of your argument.
I appreciate that.
We will revisit that.
Okay.
Steve has another question.
This one also from Twitter, from Thomas. also for both of you. Should Christians still spend time on Catholic-Protestant debate or focus elsewhere?
Well, to me, it's just priority. As I said, I think the priority now is engaging in a common enemy. But I think the questions are still, they're good ones, they're legitimate ones. And yeah, because the truth matters. You know, when I was coming of age, we were so into what I call ecumenism 1.0, which was let's get along with each other. And God knows I support that. I want us to get along, you know. But we bracketed the intellectual question.
Yeah.
As though they don't really matter, and you know, deep down we're all nice people, and so who really cares? But I think I care. I think the truth matters, and there are substantive differences on accounts of justification, of salvation, of
The Eucharist?
the sacraments, etc. The nature of the church, the papacy. I mean, so yeah, I think we can and should engage those questions, but there's a kind of prioritization now of a common enemy that has to be fought.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, had you invited me to come here this evening to participate in a Catholic-Protestant debate, I wouldn't have come. I don't have any interest in internecine battles between Christians. But that doesn't mean that when we teach systematic theology in our seminaries or in my Sunday school, that I don't lay out the different perspectives from Reformed, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and then give some assessment at the end as to which I think is the more plausible position. So I think that there's certainly room for teaching on these things, but I doubt that public debates at this time is a useful exercise.
Yeah, it's funny. I said the very same thing when we were discussing this. I said, I'd love to be on with William Lane Craig, but I said, but let's not make it into a
absolutely.
16th century debate, because I don't think that's the
Much
priority.
less a 13th century.
13th century debate, I'm in favor of. Yeah. No, so I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Well, our next question comes to us from Colleen via Facebook, and the question is, many young people are leaving Christianity. How can we keep them in the faith? And I will put that to, this is put to both of you, but whoever wants to take that first, feel free.
Boy.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
For some of those that are leaving, it may be too late. I would prefer to talk about how can we prevent this from happening, and that was related to what I said about training your children. We mustn't give our children over to the youth pastor or the youth ministry at the church and expect them to disciple them. We need to do it, and especially fathers need to do it, not mothers. The fathers are instructed in Scripture with the admonition and instruction of the children. And to see a male figure who believes in Christ, who has given his life to Christ, and then is teaching this to his children is a tremendous example for the children to follow. And I think this kind of instruction in the home is the best way to prevent children from leaving the faith eventually. Let them confront the objections first in the home before they confront them in the grade school or the high school, and then they won't be caught off guard. So we're actually developing children's materials at Reasonable Faith to teach children on the attributes of God, for example, and to give them a more grounded Christian faith.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sort of heading them off at the pass is a good thing, that we should be involved in this preventative work. The studies are very clear when they ask young people, why are you leaving? As I say, number one, science and religion. So I think that's got to be addressed. One of the major ones, too, is always the church's sexual teaching. So especially today, this is a major obstacle for people. How could you be so cruel to a gay person or a transgender person? And so the perception that the church is negative toward people and their self-determination, that's a major issue. Brandon, help me, because we've done some of, what's another one that the young people often... Yeah, the notion of God, which we talked about a lot in our afternoon session, confusion about God, I would say, is an issue that comes up in the surveys. Yeah, that's right. Good. No, thank you. Biblical interpretation. So we touched on some of the scientific things, but violence in the Bible, that comes up a lot. How could God be so cruel and so violent and so genocidal, et cetera, et cetera? So those are some of the things that we're facing that the young people say prompt them to leave. So I think you've got to engage that with them. I think answer some of the questions.
We may have 3 minutes. Okay, we may have asked something to this effect already. Noel on Facebook asks, what book has most changed your life? And let's leave the Bible out of the equation. Yeah. Other book besides the Bible.
Yeah. I think for me it was the book, The Resurrection of Theism by Stuart Hackett. As Bishop Barron shared, in college I had been taught that there are no good arguments for God's existence. The only kind of apologetic we had was a kind of negative apologetic from Francis Schaeffer that if Christianity were not true, then human life and culture go down the drain and all you're left with is despair. But it didn't give you any positive reason to think that God actually did exist. And upon graduation, I came across this book by Stuart Hackett called The Resurrection of Theism, in which Hackett was defending all of these traditional arguments for the existence of God and presenting against them so powerfully the objections that when I would read the objections, I thought, oh, well, that's it. He'll never be able to answer that. And then he would dismantle the objections. And that, for me, was absolutely revelatory, and I think caused me to take a fork in my life that has changed my life and my entire ministry because of my commitment to the value of so-called natural theology.
You know, I'd say mine would be Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain.
Okay.
When I was a kid, so I discovered Aquinas when I was about 14 or so and started reading and thinking about religious matters. Then when I was about 16, I read this wonderful autobiography by a man who was, you know, very much a man of the world and a secularist and so on, and then becomes first a Catholic and then eventually a Trappist monk. So this radical giving of his life over to the Lord. And the story is told in this very kind of romantic way. It's a story about someone falling in love with God. And that book filled in a lot of the gaps for me. You know, so Aquinas was opening up the intellectual dimension, and then Merton filled in a lot of the emotional and experiential side of it. And I would say that book probably set me on the path toward the priesthood. Okay. So I'd say the Seven-Story Mountain.
Wonderful, yeah. Were you going to introduce the next section, or was I? I forgot.
You were.
Okay.
But I will introduce you so you can introduce them.
All right, go ahead.
Introduce and going.
All right. Now we are going to spend 20 minutes with Professor Feser and me completely staying out of things. And we are going to allow these two gentlemen to ask questions and answer them, ask questions of each other. And Bishop Barron, I think we'll start with your first question to Dr. Craig.
Yeah, good, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. I mentioned you today, I first discovered you in the great debates with Hitchens and Dawkins, and I remember the Sam Harris debate, especially at Notre Dame, was a strong one, a powerful one. Here's my question to you, and you know, I admired so much the way you handled the aggressiveness of the atheists. Was there ever a time in those debates where they said something that caught you short, or where you said, like, yeah, that's a legitimate point, or I never thought of it that way? Was there ever a moment where they got to you a bit, or made you think about something in a fresh way?
Well, not in the debates that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Those were not great debates.
Yeah.
But I remember I debated the humanist philosopher Austin Dacey at Purdue University. And Dacey had a number of objections that I hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
And the key to successful debating is preparation, to successfully anticipate the arguments of your proponents and then prepare briefs to respond to them. And I had nothing on these objections from Dacey, and so just had to wing it. And so that was a real challenge. That was one of the...
What was one of the objections?
I can't remember anymore. It had, I think, to do with philosophy of mind, actually, which is not my area of specialization, you see. It was based upon arguments against the existence of God using arguments that materialists and reductive physicalists would use in the philosophy of mind to deny the reality of the soul or the reality of the mind. And except he was using them to say there is no immaterial mental substance God. And so it was a different approach that caused me to have to go back to my study. And I thought, if I ever debate Dacey again, I'm going to be ready the next time. And so we had a rematch at the university in Fresno, and it went much better.
Can I just say this? The very first time I think I ever saw you, many years ago, it was a debate that was hosted by William F. Buckley.
Yes, with John Dominic Crossan, right?
What, I forget it. There were
Peter Atkins. Well, Buckley did two of my debates.
But it was somebody who was arguing in a very scientific way.
Yeah, that was Atkins, Peter Atkins.
And I remember he said, well, name me one thing that the sciences cannot adjudicate. And you rattled off like 8 things, just like this. And you see his face falling. And then Buckley, though, said, put that in your pipe and smoke it. That was the first time I ever saw you in a debate.
Yeah, that was a very good impression.
Yeah.
Buckley was a hoot. He said to us, I'm a Christian, but not a very good one.
Is that what he said?
And in the debate with John Dominic Crossan, backstage in the intermission, he had little drink whiskeys and things like this, and he got on the airplane, and he kept with him and nipping them in between.
It helps with philosophy.
But so it was really a hoot having him. If some of you younger folks don't know William F. Buckley, I mean, he's sort of the father of American political conservatism, and just very urbane British sort of accent. And so he moderated 2 debates.
And a host of a show that lasted an hour of serious conversation between 2 people, and the show was on for 35 years, Firing Line. Hard to believe it would happen today.
Yeah.
Did you want to back and forth? Go ahead.
I'm intrigued by your desire to appeal to beauty in evangelism, and this seems to me like a good idea, but I wouldn't know how to do it. I don't think it's enough to just point to the Chartres Cathedral or the Rose Window in Notre Dame or something. I don't think that is going to draw people to Christ. What can we do in our evangelism that would use beauty in some way to help present the gospel?
Well, I think, first of all, I would say it does. There's all kinds of examples of it working. Think of the famous Paul Claudel experience, precisely with that North Rose at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Seeing it converted him. Now, I mean, he moved then more fully into the experience of Catholicism, but it was seeing that window, and I think by a kind of alchemy, if the transcendentals are related to each other, that the beautiful leads to the good and to the true. But I think it affects something in the soul, it stirs something in the soul that leads you. The other example I like to use is Brideshead Revisited, where it's really a story of someone coming to the church, symbolized by the manor house of Brideshead. But Charles Ryder, who's the narrator, is like a lot of nuns today or secularists today, kind of a cool rationalist. But it was the beauty of the house that first drew him. And then once in the house, he was drawn into the challenge of the church's moral life and then to its intellectual life. So maybe I'd see it as a doorway. It's an opening of a door into the fullness of Christianity. And look at all that Balthazar's writing. I mean, all is predicated upon the primacy of the beautiful. And then he traced it from Irenaeus all the way up through Augustine and to Anselm and to John of the Cross and on to the 20th century. Someone like C.S. Lewis he uses. All people that use the beautiful or the glorious as a way in. Luther was so uneasy with the Theologia Gloriae and wanted only the Theologia Crucis. And as I read Balthazar, who commences the project with glory on purpose, I think is an answer to that. He thinks that is a way that we can start the project.
Can you put some shoe leather on that for me? I mean, I'm trying to think of practical applications. Maybe church architecture? Is that one of the things you're thinking of? That our buildings are ugly and
Well, yeah, that's
therefore
another.
not...
But when
they
I was a
don't
student,
make you ascend to the divine? or
no, quite right. When I was a student in Paris, a doctoral student, I used to give tours at Notre Dame.
Yes.
And I would gather every Wednesday at noon, and I'd come on the microphone and say, there's a tour in English at noon, and we always got a large crowd. And I would evangelize using the cathedral. Now, I couldn't do it ostensibly. It was all very clandestine. We were told, in fact, don't talk about religion. I'm not kidding. Just talk about how tall the building is and when it was built. But I wouldn't do that. I would use it to evangelize.
Yeah.
I would point to the different dimensions of the building. And, it's telling truths, but I wouldn't leave the beautiful husk behind and now we have the truth. It's the beauty of the building itself spoke the truth.
But it was your addition of speech to that made it communicate that way. Because otherwise, the cathedrals of Europe, though beautiful, are largely empty and they become tourist spots, but it's not as though they are being especially effective in bringing people to
People
faith.
forgot how to read them. Right.
Yeah, but I like your idea of using it to explain things like that, the transcendence of God.
Yeah, and when I think of heaven, I think quite readily of the North Rose window because it was meant to evoke that. With all these meditations on the number 8, the North Rose is all these permutations and combinations of 8, which for the medievals was the number evocative of eternity because it stood outside 7, which stood for the completed cycle of time. And then the way the window was configured and the beauty of it was meant to evoke the beauty of heaven. That's what we're aspiring, to. And that window speaks more powerfully to me than really any aesthetic theory that I could articulate. That window says it to me more powerfully. So I think it in fact works in many cases. You can see it in people's autobiographies, Oh.
Your turn for a
Didn't
question.
My turn. When I first heard about you, I told the story today. It was a student at the North American College in Rome when I was bemoaning the fact that we were so bad, we Christians, at battling the new atheists. And he said, well, have you heard about this William Lane Craig fellow? And at the time I had not. And I said, oh, you got to watch him. He really can do it. So I did and was very attracted to his approach. And what struck me was, here's a Protestant, here's an evangelical, but who's using what I identified as a very Catholic approach to use natural theology, I would say, and especially God argumentation, which is associated probably more with people like Thomas Aquinas and others. And that's what really struck me was, well, here's a Protestant, but using a rather Catholicizing method. So I've always been intrigued by that relationship between you and Catholicism. I know through Geisler you had that training in Thomism.
Yeah, that's true. I was trained under a Thomist
so you
who
had an
championed
exposure.
Natural theology.
Yeah, you had an exposure to it. So that leads to my question, which is, I was thinking of asking, well, why aren't you a Catholic? But I thought it'd be a little too blunt, So maybe I just rephrase it this way, is what, if anything, is there in Catholicism that especially beguiles you or attracts you or says, yeah, that's really worthwhile? And then maybe what in Catholicism most sort of puzzles you and concerns you?
Wow. I suppose the most attractive thing would be the ancient history of the church and this long, great tradition that extends all the way back to the Greek apologists and the church fathers.
Yeah.
But there are so many things that Roman Catholics believe that I just don't believe. And I couldn't become a Catholic even if I wanted to, because I just don't believe those things. I don't believe that Mary was immaculately conceived or ascended into heaven or assumed into heaven. I do think that justification is a forensic declaration on God's part. And I have real Well, boy, I'm starting to talk about all these differences now that I don't want to talk
We
about.
did a little bit. That's okay.
But so, I want to defend and champion the mere Christianity that is common to Catholics, Protestant, Orthodox, and Coptics. And it's been a thrill for me to meet Orthodox Christians around the world, Coptic Christians, who say, we're using your material, we're thankful for reasonable faith, and my heart rejoices in seeing that, even if I feel very comfortable in being a Protestant myself.
No, and I appreciate that, and I'm very sympathetic too to the kind of mere Christianity approach. I think is very useful today, and I've been very influenced by Lewis. So I very much sympathize with that. But I was intrigued by the sort of Catholicizing element, at least in the apologetic strategy.
Yes, and that is true. I appreciate the great apologists of the past, and I've often said that my approach is a classic approach of doing natural theology and then Christian evidences. Aquinas had the signs of credibility that would attend the truths of faith, and these were miracle and fulfilled prophecy. Well, the resurrection of Jesus is the premier New Testament miracle, and although as a medieval theologian who lacked the historical method, he couldn't give evidence for the historicity of the resurrection, we are much better situated today. We have better grounds historically for believing in Jesus' resurrection than these early medievals and church fathers did, who didn't have the historiographical tools to study these things. So I'm very much in sympathy with the framework of that approach.
Yeah, good.
What are Catholics doing in this area to train their people? I'm familiar with what's going on in the evangelical subculture, but what's happening in the Catholic world to train people in these things we've talked about tonight?
Not enough, honestly. It's true. And I was a seminary rector for a long time, or seminary professor for a long time, rector for 3 years. I would always try to bring an apologetic element into my teaching. When I became rector, I said, now that I was in charge, I said, well, could I ask everybody here, the Bible people, systematic people, the moral theologians, I said, I'll tell you exactly what's bugging, especially young people today. And I went through the list of the things. I said, could you bring an element of this into your instruction so that they are not just learning the history of systematic theology and so on, but they know how to use it to address the concerns of people today. And I got pushback from the faculty because that old prejudice against apologetics, that's,
really?
Oh, we're beyond catechism here, we're beyond that. Well, as the ship's going under, we better get with it. So I would say, honestly, not enough. I've tried to jump into the breach in some ways with the work that I'm doing, and I have found, I think as you have too, that when you do it in this public way, you bring it out, people, they respond.
Yes.
And even on YouTube, I've told this story before, that when I first started doing videos on YouTube, I didn't know people could make comments. Well, I discovered quickly. And 95% of them are negative. People don't write in and say, oh, God, I love you, Father Barron, and what a wonderful argument. So, but I came in time to appreciate that very deeply, because here people would never darken the door of a church. But yet I had them there. I was able to get some traction. All right, well, what do you object to exactly? And let's have a conversation. So, and then the numbers began to increase as people got interested, as they have in years. So I think that's a sign, very encouraging sign, that if we do it, this apologetics in a public way, people will respond. But I think we're not doing nearly enough in the Catholic Church.
I see. Let me ask you this.
Please.
Can you give us any prognostication of what's the future of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of statistical studies, and we're flourishing still because of a large immigrant population in our country. So a lot of the Filipinos and Hispanics, of course, who've come into our church are keeping it sort of going. If we took all the immigrants out of the equation, we'd probably be at more European levels in terms of participation, mass attendance. The numbers are hovering around 20, 25%, and that's even with the large immigrant population. If you took that out, I'm afraid we'd be down to that sort of 10% range that you find in Europe. So that's a discouraging thing. It is true today that, what's the stat? For every one person joining the Catholic Church, 6 are leaving. So that's a disquieting thing, to be sure. And the bishops certainly are aware of that. I've been arguing for a long time it ought to be our number one concern. Now, having said that, and I don't want to gainsay any of it, it's also, as you look more broadly around the Catholic Church, so not just in the West, but you see this burgeoning growth in Africa. You see burgeoning growth in Asia and Latin America. So we can get a sort of myopic Western view of things where we get sort of down, but Christianity, and also in the Protestant forms too, is burgeoning in many parts of the world. So that gives me hope. When I was doing this Catholicism series some years ago, this documentary, I made a point of going all over the world. And one of the most memorable, for me anyway, visits was to Namugongo, which is outside of in Uganda, where we celebrate the Ugandan martyrs every year on June the 3rd. And 500,000 people come to that spot. Wow. And that's where Charles Lwanga was martyred. So here's this young man put to death brutally, 1886. Anyone watching would have said, well, there's the end of Catholicism in Uganda. And now 500,000 come, and these hundreds of millions. So I take great hope from that, looking more globally at Catholicism. Though in the West, it's on hard times.
What about in the area of vocations?
Again, we're okay. We're holding our own in our country. What I find interesting now, I'm from Chicago, now I'm out here in L.A. The big cities have a harder time with vocations. Mm-hmm. You look at New York, Chicago, L.A., the numbers can be very low. But you go to La Crosse, Wisconsin, you go to Wichita, Kansas, go to Grand Rapids, Michigan, you'll find huge numbers of seminarians, where there's still, I think, a strong Catholic culture in place. And the family life is still focused on the faith. So we're holding our own in vocations, but go other parts of the Catholic world, and they can't build the seminaries fast enough. Yeah. So it depends on how you're looking.
Okay. Any other questions that either of you want to ask the other guy?
Can we have maybe it's a little too personal, but really about your spiritual life. How do you pray? I'm just curious. What's your... we know you as an intellectual. We know you as a man of the mind and books, but I'm just curious.
I don't consider myself a great prayer warrior.
Yeah.
I try to begin each day with prayer. I wake up at 5:30 a.m. each morning, and I go out into the office and pray for myself that I would be submissive and obedient to God's will, that he would convict me of sin. I pray for my wife, pray for my children and their families, and then for our special needs, such as I mentioned Stand to Reason earlier. Melinda Penner, who's a key staff worker there, fell just before Christmas and is now in a coma with serious brain injury. Pray for Melinda. Pray for upcoming speaking engagements, that I would be congenial talking to Bishop Barron.
Well, that was answered, that prayer.
Go good. And other needs of that sort. And then I'll have, after that, a time of Bible reading. Yeah. And then read 2 pages out of the Church Fathers. Oh. And over the years, I have read all of the Ante-Nicene Fathers and into the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers, just reading 2 pages a day. Yeah. And if I have time, I'll look at Operation World. Do you know that mission handbook? It's a mission handbook that on each calendar day, it has a different country of the world, and it shares the demographic profile of that country religiously and offers points of prayer and how the church is doing there. And so I may pray about those things. So that's sort of how my prayer life looks.
I appreciate that.
What about you?
I never pray. No, we wake up about the same time. I wake up about 5:30, and I do a holy hour, we call it, in the Catholic Church, pretty much every day. I go to my chapel in my residence. I have the Blessed Sacrament there and pray in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament for an hour.
Wow.
And I pray the office of the church, so that every priest is obliged to pray the Liturgy of the Hour, so-called, largely made up of the Psalms and other readings from the Fathers and from the Scripture. So I pray my way through the office of readings, we call it, and morning prayer. Often pray the rosary during that time as well. But a lot of it is just being in the presence of the Lord. One of my heroes is Fulton Sheen, who was mentioned earlier. And Sheen, was deeply interested in the ecumenical conversation and was the great advocate in the 20th century of the Holy Hour for Catholics to pray before the Blessed Sacrament. But a number of his Protestant friends were so intrigued by this that they said, we want to give an hour prayer in the presence of the Scripture. And so they, in the presence of the open Scripture, they would spend an hour. And it was their way of participating in what Sheen was talking about. But I take Sheen seriously and try to do an hour of prayer every morning before I start my day.
My.
We are just about out of time. We will give each speaker up to 5 minutes to give some kind of closing statement, maybe advice to the people here, anything you want to say, and we need to be done by 9 o'clock.
I purposely left this open. I didn't prepare anything for this part of the evening. It's been a very rich day. We spent the afternoon, a 3-hour academic symposium. I gave a brief paper, and Dr. Craig responded, and then he gave a paper to which I responded. Then the table sustained the conversation, and it was a wonderful experience. I mean, I'm an academic by training. I've been drawn now more into this administrative work as rector, now as bishop. But I love that opportunity, and I love the fact that we had Protestants and Catholics speaking about some pretty deep things. We talked about the nature of God in my talk, and then about atonement theology and penal substitution, Jesus dying for our sins and so on. So very rich conversations, and I was just very uplifted by that experience. Uplifted, too, by seeing all of you. I mean, that's a great thing. It's a Saturday night, isn't it? In Claremont, that we get this number of people to come out to listen to two speakers on Christianity and to seek a deeper understanding of the Lord. I think that's a beautiful thing to see. And so I guess I would just, again, encourage all of you to be evangelists in your daily lives.
Yes.
Part of it is a formal study of the faith and to give an account of what you believe, but a lot of it is just the texture of your life. The very beauty of your life as a follower of Christ has this radiant power. So I would encourage everybody. If we don't do it, it won't get done. We can't just wait around for other people to do it, but there must be a daily conviction to evangelize. So anyway, that's the end of my little sermonette. It's encouraging for me to see you here, and I found the whole day a very uplifting experience.
Let me just mention that I think all of you here are familiar with the problems we've been having in Santa Barbara and Montecito, with the very area where the bishop ministers. And you can't get there by car, he can't get there by the car, so the bishop is going to take a helicopter to get back for a big mass on Sunday, right?
Tomorrow, with Archbishop Gomez, we're going to helicopter back up because the 101 is shut down.
Okay.
So pray for the good people up there. I think it's 18 have been confirmed killed, and these are poor people that just recovered from the fires, that awful Thomas fire that haunted everyone for about a month, and we just got over it. And then this rain fell and this horrific mudslide. So a lot of suffering people up there. So do pray for them.
Bill?
I, too, did not prepare any sort of final remarks. I would just share my heart with you that I'm very concerned about the direction that our country has been going in over the last few decades. I feel as though I live in a different America than the America that I knew growing up as a boy. And I'm convinced that if Catholics and evangelicals can mobilize together to help reshape our culture, that we can reclaim a lot of ground that has been lost to secularism and unbelief. And so I would echo the admonition to live attractive lives of holiness and love and Christian commitment, and to work together to be salt and light in our culture.
In a moment, the four of us are going to walk out that way. I want to say that our two speakers both have to hit the road, but at any rate, before we start doing that, let's thank our two speakers for tonight.